Hey friends, I want to jump on today and talk about a new book that's out. It came out about a month ago. It's called Everest Inc. And it's the story of the last 40 years of Mount Everest, which have, really been dominated by, the growing commercialism. And it's a pretty darn good read. And I guess I have some self-interest in it because I was interviewed for a couple of hours for the book. When I was a younger man, in my early 20s, I left graduate school in journalism and got a job as an intern at Outside Magazine, and it was a great magazine then. And we loved telling stories about adventure and exploration and other in the environment and other topics too. And well, when I first started working there, I started keeping a file about Mount Everest. When I was a kid, I read a book about Mount Everest, and I always remembered, the hike in and how this expedition, which I think probably happened in the 60s. They came to these rivers and ended up with leeches on them, and just all the suffering they did. And I never really forgot about that book. Well, when I was at Outside in my first years there, I started keeping a file. And I was talking to a lot of the mountaineers at the time, reporting stories, fact-checking stories. And slowly, and this is in the early 90s, I began to see that Everest was starting to get commercialized. There were climbers there that were trying to figure out how to lead clients up the mountain and make a living at it. And so I'd say from about 1991 to 94, I kept this file going, and around 94, it started to pick up a bit more. There were a few more groups that were mountaineers that were starting to start companies to take climbers up. And well, eventually, I heard from several people, you ought to get someone to base camp. The magazine ought to put someone in base camp and report on this growing commercialism and just, kind of do a business story really about it. Well, so I was a young editor by then and had stopped being an intern and become, a junior editor and eventually an associate editor, and then later on a senior editor. Well, I think it was the winter of 94, I wrote up a story proposal, and we had these meetings. We were in Chicago at the time, and the whole staff would be there, and people would bring in story ideas. And well, I came in, kind of boldly with this story to send a writer to Everest, and it was a bold idea, kind of a crazy idea. And we sent people around the world, but sending someone to the world's highest mountain was kind of beyond what we had ever thought we would do. Well, the idea was a success, but then life happened, the magazine happened, and the story kind of got tabled for a while. And then when I pitched that story, I pitched two names for it. Among them John Krakauer. And so anyway, the story sat around for a couple of years. Our magazine moved from Chicago to New Mexico, but eventually I kept bugging my boss about it because I knew he was pretty keen on it, and I also knew he'd been talking to John Krakauer about the idea. And one day I poked my head in my boss's office and just said, "Hey, what do you think about that Everest idea? Don't you think we ought to do it?" And he looked up from his papers he was reading and said, "Yeah, I think we should. Why don't you give John a call?" And so I called John Krakauer and offered him the story to go to Mount Everest Base Camp and report on the commercialism and this kind of business story. And he accepted the assignment and got the shots and everything, got the necessary vaccinations for the travel, and began training, for the hike in, and then a few weeks later, I found out from my boss that he'd decided not to go. He decided, that it wasn't really the thing for him. But then he thought some more about it, and he realized, he wanted to go, but if he was going to go, he was going to climb to the top. He was going to try to climb the mountain. So that was a whole different story idea, but it was also, grew out from this idea to send someone to base camp. And well, that was sort of the background, the in-office background of the development of Into Thin Air. Everybody knows what happened in 1996, the year that Krakauer went to Everest. There was a lot of the climbers didn't pay attention to the turnaround time at the top of the mountain. They took risks they shouldn't have taken. And there was a traffic jam at the top as well, which slowed things down. And a storm moved in, and whiteout conditions happened, and temperatures dropped, and well, I believe 8 climbers died in that storm. Well, and so when John Krakauer barely got out, he made it down to his tent and off the top of the mountain into the South Col, and collapsed into his tent. Well, eventually he made his way down the mountain after this horrible tragedy, and so many people died, and came back and wrote the story Into Thin Air. It was I think he turned in 17,000 words. It was a massive story, and I think it ran somewhere near 10,000 words. And so, over that time period, when the story landed on my desk, I edited it, and then the story came out, and I sat in for a lot of interviews. There was a big media frenzy around the story, and also around that tragedy. Well, it was a seminal moment in my life, and this book I began to talk about, Everest Inc., talks about that whole period of time and a lot more, and it really shows in kind of a braided way just the development of the commercialization of Mount Everest and it doesn't take a necessarily negative view of it. It was probably inevitable, and so, Will Cockrell, who wrote the book, kind of takes the attitude that commercialization was inevitable, and that there were actually, some good people doing that kind of work. And well, it's a good book anyway. I'll pause there, and I just want to jump on today and give Will Cockrell, a good writer, a shout out, and say that Everest Inc.'s a good read. And if you liked Into Thin Air, or if you like armchair travel in general, I'd pick it up. It's worth the time.